My name's Jessica Neal. I'm the Chief Executive of the Stephen Lawrence Day Foundation. I'm also a mother, a sister, a daughter, a wife, a feminist, and a passionate advocate for racial equity.
I guess since, when I first met you, you were working at Selfridges as a children's wear buyer?
That's right.
Okay. So I guess, could you maybe elaborate on where you started in terms of your education and to where you are now?
Yeah, my educational journey was not the most straightforward and not as connected as you might expect with where I am now. I went to a really good secondary school, partly because I was a bit of a tearaway up until that point. And so my parents sent me to a really strict private school to try and get me back on track. And we did a bit of a deal that if I got my head down and concentrated and did well academically, that I would be able to stop my educational journey at that point, which I did. And I went from there to college where I studied hairdressing. And even while I was studying hairdressing, I had this like restlessness to want to get out and work. And so I went straight from there and worked in a salon. I went up to level 2 with my MBQ in hairdressing, I think. And then I was like, right, that's it. I'm done studying. I'm done being told what to do, what to wear. And yeah, I went out to work and started hairdressing at that point. I did that for a couple of years. I worked for a few local salons. I think my first job was 13. I was a junior in a salon around school and college. And then I went off to work at a salon in Parsons Green. That was the last salon I worked in. And that was right at the heart of the kind of WAG era, Chloe Paddington it bag zone. And I was obsessed with fashion, obsessed with the glamour and the luxury of it. And I decided that I wanted to do something in that sector, but I wasn't degree educated. Fashion is an incredibly competitive area of work. And so I got my first job in the industry on reception at a footwear manufacturer. They were based out in Yorkshire back in the day before footwear production went overseas, but we had a head office in Baker Street in London, which was ideal for me. We were across the road from Selfridges. We had this showroom that was lined with designer samples, and it gave me a taste of all of the different areas of the industry that go on behind the scenes that you often don't know about unless you're in the sector and working. From there, I worked my way up. I kind of recognised that if I was going to succeed in the sector, I would need to graft really hard. I don't know subconsciously how much of that was because I recognised as a woman of colour and had kind of received those messages growing up about needing to work twice as hard, but kind of even though I'd made the deal with my parents about the academic route I took, there was no question in my mind that excellence was the only route to success and graft. And so I worked hard, and it was a straightforward job. You know, I was responsible for like booking meeting rooms, making tea, changing the tape over, and it was a physical tape in the CCTV system that had to be changed over. And I just made sure I worked really hard and tried to offer to be helpful. And eventually I worked my way up to train as a merchandiser, wholesale merchandiser. And I worked my way up until I was a merchandiser and I was looking after a couple of key accounts. And from there, I remember being a merchandiser in that kind of wholesale space. And the buyers, we worked with a couple of the big high street names, and they'd come in for appointments to make selections. And there was always this sense of like dread and fear when the buyers were coming. It was such a strange power dynamic. And of course, being however old I was at the time, 18, 19, I was like, I want to be on that side of the table where all the power is. But of all of the different areas of fashion, maybe with the exception of design, buying is exceptionally competitive, and I didn't have the kind of traditional pathway in. So I went from there to work in off-price buying, which if I was after glamour and power, I had really misinterpreted what off-price buying would be like. And I worked for a couple of different off-price retailers and kind of worked my way up and built up a network. And I think that chapter of my career was really important for me, because if it was the kind of glamour and power that attracted me to buying and fashion, it was that period and the people that I worked with at that time that taught me quite a lot about humility, because off-price buying is about cold calling. It's about people shutting the door in your face. I went to see a brand once and I went to their showroom and this guy hid in the cupboard so he didn't have to talk to me about giving me his off-price stock. And then I moved over to full price. I worked at a couple of high street retailers, and then I went to work for a guy called Alex who had an online kids wear store. And he was like a a real entrepreneur. I think he'd worked at Coca-Cola in advertising at some point in his career, or marketing, and he was just an entrepreneur in the true sense of the word. He was the kind of person who could sell you a concept and get you excited about it in a way that there was no other outcome other than success, you know? And I learned so much in that space because it was a real startup environment. There was really high energy. There was a sense of everybody pitching in, and you had a role, but really you were involved in a bit of finance, a bit of operations, a bit of marketing. And when you had a new concept, which is what I was working on, a new area of the business, you had to take a really holistic approach and think of all of the different functions that would need to come together in order for that to succeed. So that was an important learning period for me. I probably would never have left there. I loved the people I worked with so much until Selfridges called. There was an opportunity in their kidswear buying team, and through some of the connections I'd made earlier on in my career, I was recommended. And it's an interesting one. It's not a story I've told often, but I interviewed for the kidswear buying role at Selfridges and was rejected for the role on the grounds that I had only had e-commerce experience rather than bricks and mortar. And at that point, Selfridges bricks and mortar stores were a much bigger part of their business. And the head of buying and merchandising at the time was on the panel interviewing and had my CV at home, and his wife happened to see my CV, and unbeknownst to me, she was somebody that I had worked with during my time at this kidswear retailer, and she said to her husband, "Oh, she's great, I've worked with her and you should speak to her." And so they called me back in and I was offered the role. And there's been a few moments like that across my career. I'll tell you about another one later, where the strength of relationships and the way that you treat people, the way people feel about you above and beyond anything that you achieve kind of from a tangible perspective, that's really propelled me on in my career. And it's something I value more and more the older I get, is the strength of those relationships and those connections. So I worked at Selfridges for a couple of years. I loved it there. It was a lot of what I thought buying in fashion would be, you know, big budgets. I think the kidswear department at that time was like a £25 million business, more than that even. Yeah, I loved it. I loved the budgets. I loved the freedom and the flexibility. Brands wanted to be in Selfridges, and so that it meant you were able to kind of pick and choose which brands that you worked with. But there was also a flip side of that. A business at Selfridges scale is a slower business to turn. And whilst they are really very much at the forefront of fashion, kidswear is a different department from menswear or womenswear or accessories. And still you are kind of anchored by a couple of those big hero brands, which are maybe more traditional. And so whilst there was kind of power and freedom and flexibility, it was ultimately somebody else's store, somebody else's money. And whilst the budgets are big, it wasn't your money. And so in some ways you weren't as free to make the decisions that you wanted to make. And I met along the way some extraordinary brands, some really interesting people, and we did some great things with contemporary pop-ups and things. But ultimately I reached a point a couple of years in where I had a vision for what kidswear could look like that was much less gender specific, that was less reliant on brands and more about curation of beautiful products in a really editorial environment. And I moaned a lot to my family about it. I would, ring mum and rant about wanting to do this, not wanting to work with this business, etc. And she said, "Why don't you just do it for yourself?" Kind of flippantly. But actually, once that seed was planted, I started to really think about what would it look like if I built a kidswear business from the ground up. What would that retail experience feel like? How would I treat the product? How would I treat photography, the styling? How would I create something that was ultimately products for children, but a shopping experience for parents, because that would be who's buying the clothes. And so I came up with the concept, and I resigned from my role. I started reaching out to people for investment, which was a really interesting process. Yeah. I guess going right back to my roots, so my mum is black, her parents are from Jamaica, my dad is white, and a lot of the early conversations that we had about race, gender, etc. It felt like we had those conversations a lot with my dad. He's quite an opinionated guy. And so I think my original framing of the world and of my role in it probably came through his eyes, through the eyes of a white guy who'd grown up with a certain level of privilege. And so I think at that stage in my life and that stage in my career, when I went out looking for finance for this concept, the fact that I was a woman, the fact that I was a black woman, probably didn't necessarily enter my mind in terms of the barriers that I was facing. I think I lacked context, and that gave me a confidence and a kind of self-belief that was helpful. But the older I've got, I think the lack of context has also been unhelpful in terms of understanding where I actually fit, and also unhelpful in terms of compassion and empathy for other people who haven't been afforded the same privileges that I have, kind of coming up to that point. So all the way back to looking for funding. And I think knowing what I know now about the number of women who receive, seed funding from venture capitalists, etc., I can understand why I didn't succeed in that space. But I was absolutely relentless. I must have had, 50 conversations with all different potential finances. And the answer was always the same. It was like, the concept is good, your background is well aligned, retail's a risky model, do you know how many businesses fail in the first 5 years? You need to get it up and running and prove the concept, and then come back. And of course, how do you get it up and running and prove the concept if you don't have the money to make it start? And I think I probably also was really ambitious for the brand. Coming out of a luxury department store, I had ideas about what the treatment would look like, what the website would be like, what the packaging would be like, and all of those things came with a cost attached. And
are you saying it was a colour thing? Why you didn't get the finance? Is that what you're saying?
I think that the feedback was probably true,
right?
And ultimately, the business succeeded in some ways and failed in other ways. So some of the feedback that I was given in those early days was definitely spot on, but I think, knowing what I know now about the full landscape, I don't know that I didn't know it at the time. I think it just wasn't at the front of my mind, which is maybe why I was so kind of outrageously, you can only be that kind of first time entrepreneur where you're naive and you're like, I've got this idea and I'm going to make it happen. I don't know that gender or race played a part in how difficult it was for me to secure funding and to get the idea off the ground and get people to believe in me. But I also don't know that it didn't. And when I look back on it now, I kind of laugh at my naivety that I even thought that I could. But I did. And I went to my grandma's one Friday evening. It was like family is like my religion. And it was a Friday night ritual that we'd all kind of gather at my grandma's house. We called it Grandma's Friday Night House Party. And I went there after the 455 millionth rejection. And I was practicing my pitch and saying to my mum and, different members of the family, like, can you listen to this and tell me, like, what are the bits I'm missing? How can I give them more confidence, etc., etc. And I got halfway through and mum said, I could probably give you a little bit of money towards this. And I hadn't thought to ask because I talked about, I grew up in an environment where I was lucky enough my parents could afford to send me to private school. So I grew up with a level of privilege, but we weren't a wealthy family by any stretch. My parents worked hard. It's just that they happened to come up in the 80s and they were both successful professionally. And so it had never occurred to me to ask the question. And then my grandma said, yeah, I'd be willing to support. And my uncle said, yeah, I'd be willing to support, literally like kind of round the dinner table. And in that one day, I'd raised a part of the funding that I needed. And then other friends chipped in. My partner at the time, now my husband, said, yeah, like, let's try and make this happen as a family. And I raised much less than I was asking for, but it was enough to do what was being asked of me, which was prove the concept. And so that meant I could go out and start saying to brands, right, I'm ready to buy. And that kind of period is a bit of a blur, like what it takes to take a business from that initial concept to something that is kind of live and ready for customers to interact with. It took everything that I had. And it was a really intense but also magical period. I was kind of in this whirlwind of belief. I was really kind of singularly focused on this vision that I had for this business. And I think that vision and that focus propelled me to get it live. I think it also propelled me to make some mistakes because I think I was so laser focused on what I wanted to achieve and how I saw it. I don't think that I gave enough space to testing and listening and responding and learning to the customers. But I had, from my previous experience, I had a good understanding of where the opportunity was in the market, which brands were kind of on the up, which brands were on the down. And I could see where the future was going in terms of a kids' wear aesthetic that was less like blue dinosaurs for boys, girls, glitter, sequins, and more of a kind of kids wear fashion as an expression of playfulness and joy, but in a less obvious way, less kind of gendered, etc. So yeah, we built the business, and we had some extraordinary successes along the way. We had a couple of pop-up stores. We won a competition, which gave us a pop-up space in Knightsbridge. We had a concession for quite a while in Phoenix on Bond Street. The online business got a lot of interest. We had some extraordinary brands. And we worked in that business for 5 years. And over that time, I had my 2 children, working for myself.
Must have been tough.
It was extraordinarily hard. I looked back on an interview that I gave at the time, laughing about having a startup and a newborn. And even though it was hard, I remember being in my first trimester and being shocked by how ill and tired I felt, and just not being able to stop because there is nobody else, there's no team. But it also afforded me freedom and flexibility that I would never otherwise have had. You know, I was able to, we went to Paris when Izzy was not particularly old to do, you know, to do the shows and to do the buying season. And I'd, you know, be in a buying appointment and whip my boob out and breastfeed the baby and be typing an order on the other side. And I don't know that I had a lot of confidence at that point in my life, or a different type of confidence at that point in my life. But I don't think that I would have felt empowered to do that if I was working for somebody else. There's you know, you're representing someone else's brand. There's a level of professionalism that's expected. And when I had my own business, it was just me and this brand baby that I loved and this baby that I loved. And we just kind of went along and did our thing. And it was a chaotic, hectic time, but it was also joyous. And I was, I think I've always been quite a restless person from, you know, childhood onwards. And that kind of busyness, but with focus, is a happy place for me.
So the business no longer exists, right?
Yeah.
But would you ever go back into buying?
No.
Really?
No, I don't think that I would. And, you know, it's funny because that laser focus that I had about the business, prior to that, I had it about buying. It was something that I loved. It kind of appealed to all the different spaces of my brain, you know, my creativity, the kind of more analytical trading. Right. I loved the trading element. The buying and the glamour was what drew me in, but it was the trading that really got me excited as I got into buying, you know, looking at a range of products and thinking what's going to work, what's not going to work, what do we know about our customer, what does history tell us, but also what insight do we have into the future. And I absolutely loved it. But I think the thing is, when you then do it for yourself, I can't now imagine buying for somebody else. I loved the freedom and the creativity. And the flip side of that freedom is the ultimate accountability. You know, if it works and if it doesn't work, it is purely on your shoulders. And I worked with some extraordinary people along the way, but I didn't have a co-founder. I didn't have a business partner. And having your family as your investors is a beautiful thing, because it means the pressure that you feel isn't kind of people yelling at you in board meetings or scrutinizing what you do. But actually sometimes that scrutiny and accountability is what keeps you on track. And the fear that you feel of failure when it's your family's hard-earned money, people have pulled money out of their pensions to kind of finance you along the way, friends have believed in you and kind of got caught up in the excitement and the energy. The pressure that you feel to get it right is immense.
So you would get back into fashion if it was your own business? I
think that I was so laser focused on buying and fashion as a career path. And that focus, like I said, it propelled me to achieve all sorts of things that I'm really proud of. But later in my career, I've taken all kinds of unexpected pivots. Right. Because of circumstances, and I've discovered things, joy and fulfillment in spaces that were no way part of my plan. And so I think it would be difficult for me to step back into fashion. And the other thing is that I love now is interacting with fashion as a customer. You know, working in fashion, Selfridges always was and probably always will be my favourite store. But there is something really different when you've seen behind the curtain. And I love interacting with fashion without being part of what goes on behind the scenes, and just being able to enjoy it and weave it into my life as an expression of who I am, rather than working in fashion being a part of my core identity, which I think is what I've moved on from now. But at that point in my career, it definitely was. So we had this business, and because we'd started off with that smaller amount of money because we didn't have a choice. And because my ambitions were so high, I think that running into cash flow difficulties was an inevitability, and that kind of chased me throughout that period that we were running the business. You know, we'd go through this cycle of doing extraordinarily well during peak season and being like, this is it, we're just about to go over the edge and get to break even. And then you'd hit a more difficult trading patch and you'd be like, shit, how am I going to pay myself? How am I going to service all of this debt that I've racked up trying to keep this thing going? And we reached a point where Izzy was, I think she was about 1.5. I was pregnant with Isaac and we needed a proper injection of cash, and it was a real kind of inflection point. Are we going to put the cash in, and where's it going to come from, or are we just going to stop? And it almost got more difficult as the business grew, as we had the concession and we had more success online and we were growing. The business needed more money, and it wasn't the kind of money that we could just come up with. So we decided to take a risk, and we sold our flat in London. And we moved to Hastings on the East Sussex coast. And it was a real, like, where can we live where we can live in a beautiful Victorian house like we'd like to be living in where we lived in Fulham at the time, but for significantly less. And Hastings came up. We'd never been. We didn't know anybody who lived there. And we went and looked at some houses, and there was something about it that kind of spoke to my background. So my grandparents moved over from Jamaica, and they lived in kind of around Notting Hill and Fulham before Notting Hill and Fulham were what they are now, you know, in the 50s and 60s. And so the architecture in Hastings really mirrors that. And there's this sense where we live now, kind of in those areas of all of this beautiful architecture and history, and an area that's like right on the brink of becoming something exciting. And actually, when you look at what Notting Hill and Fulham have become now, as much as they're beautiful affluent areas, you realise that that period of time before was where the magic happened, before they became gentrified and the people who made them what they are were forced out. And I get that feeling in Hastings now, you know. So yeah, we looked at it, I fell in love, and it provided a solution for us. It meant that we could release the equity from our house, invest it into the business. And so there we were, a couple of hours away from my family, in this gorgeous house with this business and these two very small children, like a newborn and a 2-year-old, up to our necks in chaos and dispatch and without our infrastructure and support. And we relaunched the website, and it was this sense of like, this is it. And it wasn't it. It wasn't it. We definitely saw some success, but ultimately the cash injection we needed was significantly bigger than what we were able to put in through selling the house. And that was a really hard time. My husband is much more risk averse than I am. And I think I had kind of elbowed him along on this journey with me. And then there we were, away from our friends and family, not at a commutable distance from proper jobs, with this business that ultimately couldn't succeed without a massive injection of cash. And I was exhausted. I didn't have the energy to go out and pitch for finance. I'm not sure that I would have been able to successfully anyway, but I definitely couldn't at that place. And at some point we made the decision that we had to stop. And that was difficult, but also a bit of a relief. Like when you've been an entrepreneur and you've been operating at that pace for that number of years and with that level of stress, there was also a relief in saying, actually, I'm not going to do this anymore. And then we were in Hastings with 2 tiny kids saying, what the hell are we going to do now? What next? My husband was an estate agent, and he was able to just slot right back into that where we were. But for me, then it was, you know, the question you asked, do I want to go back into buying? Do I want to work for somebody else, having had my own business for this amount of time? And so I just started looking at jobs, you know, what's in Sussex, what's happening, what might I want to do? And, you know, you will know this from running your own business. You go into it with a subject matter expertise that you're kind of something that you're good at and you're passionate about. But by the time you've built a business to a certain scale, you've done everything. You've done kind of cleaning, warehouse work, Photoshop, everything. Not necessarily successfully, but you've done everything. And so I felt a different kind of confidence. On one hand, my confidence was really bruised from having had this significant failure, you know.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I felt quite confident that I could turn my hand to lots of different things, having had to do that in the business. I saw this job for a centre director of a rape crisis charity.
Right.
And the context now, we were well away from the kind of WAG, Chloe Paddington era, and we were talking about Brexit and Trump. And I had started to feel a personal sense of wanting to align my day-to-day actions with my personal values and politics. I felt a sense of fear about the world and the context that I was raising these two little black kids in. And I wanted to, and also in reality, if I was going to leave these two tiny kids who I'd been really present for the first couple of years of their life and go off and do something else for somebody else, I needed it to be something meaningful. So this job really spoke to me, and I went off and I interviewed, and it was a really different environment than Selfridges. I was over in Crawley in West Sussex in this little building. I was working with this extraordinary team of women. And it was one of the most life-changing experiences I have ever had, because the women that I worked alongside, the women that we worked with, it taught me so much about the privileges that I had been afforded, about the structure of society, about who is and isn't supported. And it was this eye-opening, empowering experience, and really taught me a lot about my own feminism. But it wasn't perfect. I had some really difficult interactions there. And I think that's when I started to recognise how the different parts of my identity, being a woman, being a black woman, being a mother, being a wife, all of these different parts of what make you who you are. And I'd also left a part of my identity behind in moving forward from being somebody that works in fashion to doing this new thing. And I came up against a challenge in that space of needing to speak out against something that was happening that I knew wasn't right, but knowing that that would have catastrophic consequences. And I had just come out of this big failure in my own business. I'd come into this space that felt something like salvation, you know, doing something that's really grounded in your morals, working with extraordinary women, supporting other women when they're going through some of the most profound periods of trauma. And at the same time, there being something really difficult there. So it ended with me raising a grievance against the chief executive and the board at the time, and ultimately the charity closed down. It was off the back of my own business closing, working in this incredible environment for a year, for that to then close. And I came out of that journey kind of in the midst of the pandemic. I suppose I was in survival mode. I registered a business to do consultancy. I went out and reached out to contacts in the retail space, in the charity space. I did some great work with some extraordinary organisations, but I definitely felt lost. I was coming off the back of what felt like huge personal failures, trying to figure out who I was now with these two young kids, living in a different place than the place I'd grown up in, having had these really profound experiences, but not quite achieved what felt like success at the time. But slowly over time, the consultancy was a really kind of cathartic process for me, because it enabled me to step into working environments with clients and share my experiences with them, my perspective, but without that emotional connection that you feel when it's a job or it's when it's your own business. And over time, I kind of rebuilt my confidence, but confidence that looked really different than that kind of naive confidence I had earlier on in my career. This was about a kind of settled sense of who I am, the compromises I'm willing to make, and the compromises that feel more like my core values being compromised. The process of moving through the Rape Crisis Network had meant speaking up about things that I didn't agree with, about the racism, the transphobia in the sector, with some real consequences for speaking up for what I felt was right. And so, I came out of that period feeling, I guess, grounded in who I was, and maybe a greater sense of reality about the world that I was operating in. And then the opportunity at the Stephen Lawrence Day Foundation came up, and that role has been extraordinary. Working alongside people where I feel that there's a real alignment of values, and where there is a recognition that in order to achieve meaningful societal change, we have to be, for sure, centering young Black kids, but thinking about how different systems of oppression intersect, and how, if we want to make meaningful change in the world, we need to be thinking about how we can work in coalition with as many different people as possible, and ultimately look at those who are most marginalised in society. So young Black children, women, those from the LGBTQIA plus community. How can we be working in coalition to lift up everybody who is most marginalised in our society?
And then you mentioned earlier on that you're a feminist. So describe, according to Jessica, what a feminist is.
Wow. My feminism has definitely evolved over time. I think it's always been a part of who I am, but I think similarly to what I was saying before, I think it's probably grounded now in slightly broader context. Okay. For me, in the mini edit days and in the fashion days, it meant not having boys' clothes that were like, predators in dark colours, and girls' clothes that were like prey and butterflies and sequins and daddy's little cupcake and that kind of thing. We came out with this amazing line of sweatshirts that said "strong like my sister," girl power, feminist. And I just, at that point, it was about a statement of who you were. And then moving into the Rape Crisis Network, it was about sisterhood and solidarity. It was about empathy. It was about understanding the real life consequences of living in a patriarchal system, and the profound trauma that women and girls, children experience as a result of that. But also being part of the Rape Crisis Network and the women's sector more broadly, which is a really white space. It also made me realise, my personal view is that my feminism can't be, I can't separate out my feminism from my passion around racial equity in the same way I can't separate out my womanhood from my Blackness. Okay. Those two things are completely enmeshed in who I am. Yeah. And I think they're enmeshed in society as well. And I think feminism is about equity, as is racial justice. And I think that if any of us are to achieve meaningful freedom and equity, it can only happen if all of us achieve those things. So yeah, at its core, feminism is about equity. It's about rebuilding society from the ground up with structures that place value on all human life and celebrate us for our differences and create an equitable platform for all of us to thrive. And I think that that same language could be used for any group who are marginalised in our society. So women, Black people, people from the LGBTQIA plus community. I feel like it's what we should be hoping for all of us. And I think what is lost in feminism today, or in lots of feminist movements today, is it isn't enough to only advocate for yourselves. If you're a white feminist and you're not also advocating for the rights of a Black trans woman, then the likelihood of achieving meaningful change in society, I think, is pretty slim. Okay.
So Jessica, you strike me as someone who's very confident and very clear and strident in terms of your kind of target and approach. Has that always been the case since you were a child?
I think if my mum was here, she would say definitely yes. I've definitely always had strong convictions, I think is a diplomatic way of putting it. And it's not something that I can or necessarily would change about myself. Yeah. But I think the older I got, the more I reflect on needing to consciously balance that. So we talked about, in running your own business, the importance of having kind of courage in your convictions and a really clear vision for what you're trying to execute to kind of propel you when things are difficult and to keep you going. And also to give you the courage to do it, even though the likelihood is that you can and will fail. But also I think that it did lead to the failure of the business, in that I was so dead set on this one way of doing things that I don't think I was willing to compromise enough or to adapt to what the customer wanted, to the environment and how that was changing. And so I think I'm And more broadly, when I think about kind of my politics and my feminism and my role now, I think having a really close alignment between your values and your actions will always be a core part of who I am. But I also really value now listening and learning and thinking about other people's experiences and perspectives and hearing other people's voices, so that when I'm making decisions, I'm making them from a really well-rounded perspective. I'm obsessed with the idea of diversity, and not in the kind of corporate DEI tick box sense, but in the sense that how can you be sure that you're making good decisions in life, in a business, in any context, if you don't have different perspectives to support that decision? And so I'm fascinated with how we can build, particularly in business, how we can build environments where people at all levels of an organisation are empowered to contribute to how decisions are made, to the strategic direction, to the day-to-day operations, so that you're hearing everybody's different voices and that kind of collective input. How there's processes and structures that support you bringing all those things together, so that you can still be agile, you can still be decisive, so that you're not making every decision by committee, but that there's a clear sense of your collective values that isn't reliant on everybody being the same. So yeah, I'm fascinated by that, and how through the work that we do, we can support other organisations to really lean into the power of diversity. Because I think, particularly in working with young people, it's where I get my hope from. I think about social justice and equity as like a bit of a relay race, and this bit that we're doing it only represents a small part of the journey, which is thankful, because the wider political context, it sometimes feels like we're going backwards. And I think many of the most profound challenges that we face as a society, we don't really have the answers to. And I think my personal belief is that there are some people out there, some young people from marginalised communities, who have the answers. And so our job is not to come up with the answers ourselves, it's to empower those people to give us the solutions that we're looking for, to give them a seat at the table, to connect them with opportunities, to give them the courage and the confidence in their own convictions, so that they can help us find the solutions. You know, the thing that we're all looking for, I think, is some wildly different reality than the one we're living in, that we can't even possibly imagine. And so we need to empower young people to dream and be ambitious for themselves, and give them the tools to convert their ideas into the reality that we all so desperately need.
So, like, because of the role you're in now, what advice would you give to the younger Jessica?
Wow, that is a great question. On one hand, I wouldn't want to change anything, because I love where I am now. The journey has been bruising and painful and magical. And I feel really fulfilled and content. And I feel a real sense of belonging, probably for the first time in my career. So I wouldn't want to change anything along the way, because I'm really happy with where I am now. But probably what I would say to myself is, success is not an external thing. You know, you can have a whole list of things that you want to achieve, but ultimately, true, meaningful success is those things. It's fulfillment, it's belonging, and it's how close you can get that alignment between your core values, who you are as a person and what you do, how you show up in the world on a day-to-day basis. And the closer the alignment between those two things, the more joy and fulfillment that you will find. And I think earlier on in my career, I was really wedded to that idea of excellence and achievement and hitting certain milestones, and the fulfillment attached to those milestones. It's really short-lived. You know, you tick that box, you do that thing, and then it's straight on to the next. Whereas kind of gratitude and contentment, there's something much more present about that kind of joy. You know, you're in the moment, living in the moment that you're in, and enjoying it. So I think I don't know if that's advice, but that's what my reflections.
Cool. So like, what would you say is the most inspiring project that you've worked on throughout your illustrious career?
Illustrious. It would definitely be part of the Stephen Lawrence Day Foundation. I have the privilege of working with the most extraordinary group of people, both within the organisation and externally with our partners. It's one of my favourite things about the organisation is that we work with lots of exceptional larger organisations, but also some really fantastic, impactful Black-led community organisations. And this sense that anything is possible, that change is possible. It's definitely the most inspirational thing I've ever done.
All right, and in terms of like the next 5 to 10 years, what will people expect to see from Jessica Neal?
What I would like people to see is less of me and more of the foundation. I think I love the idea of playing a real behind the scenes role and building the brand and the foundation and achieving extraordinary things on behalf of the foundation and taking a real behind the scenes role. I've had my time kind of running my own business and building something in my name and my vision. And I think this for me is about the young people that we work with, the extraordinary team that I have the privilege to be part of. And I want to build really stable foundations for future growth.
So Jessica, it's been really great hearing your story. It's been really inspiring just hearing the steps that you've taken in your career progression. So we're just going to wrap up the interview with a quick fire A or B type questions. So first one, here it comes, Beyonce or Whitney?
Oh God. Whitney, I think. That's hard. Oh.
You iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Lifetime supply of makeup or lifetime supply of hair products?
Makeup. I look like an egg if I don't have my eyebrows drawn on.
R&B or Afrobeats?
R&B.
How about I think I know what you're going to say. A really well-paid job.
Yeah.
And it's a toxic environment.
Yeah.
Or a low-paid job and it just feels like heaven every day.
Heaven every day.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Ideally, high-paid and heaven is the best, but
okay.
yeah.
How about fish and chips or rice and peas?
Rice and peas.
Okay. Right. The Apprentice or Dragon's Den?
Ooh. Dragon's Den, because I think the businesses are a bit more authentic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
and Alan Sugar says some wild things these days.
A holiday in the Maldives or a romantic trip to Paris?
Oh, I love Paris, but I've worked in Paris a lot, and so it doesn't feel so romantic. So I'd say definitely the Maldives.
And last one, heels or trainers?
There was a period of my life, this is not a quickfire answer, there was a period of my life where I didn't own any flat shoes, but it's trainers all day, every day. There can't be heels on the school run.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. It's been inspiring hearing your story, and we'll include your social links in the description below.
Thank you. It's been lovely.